In this video, I will be performing the Pavane in E minor by François Dufaut. Like all of Dufaut's works, it was composed for the lute, and while any time a piece is performed on an instrument not intended by the composer, we are dealing with some form of transcription. A lot of lute music can be performed on the harpsichord with minimal changes of the musical text, and sometimes no changes at all. Dufaut is one of my favorite 17th century composers of lute music, but in general he doesn't seem to be very well known. So I would like to start by providing some biographical information about him. Dufaut was born around 1604. He moved to Paris around 1629 and must have quickly established himself as one of the leading lutenists there. Indeed, a collection of lute music published in 1631 by Pierre Ballard that includes pieces by Dufaut along with composers associated with the court certainly attests to Dufaut's reputation. He traveled to England around 1650. By 1653, he was at the court in Innsbruck. He returned to Paris around 1655 and left again for England around 1662. It is likely that he died in England sometime before 1672. He seems to have been a celebrated lutenist throughout his life, and judging by the significant number of his pieces that are preserved in Austrian and German manuscripts, he must have been especially influential and appreciated in those two countries. The Pavane in E minor appears in the Vaudry de Sezenay manuscript, which is an important source of music for the lute and theorbo, dating from 1699, and is named after its copyist, Jean-Étienne Vaudry de Sezenay. It follows the standard form of a pavane, which means there are 3 sections, each of which is repeated. While the overall harmonic trajectory also appears to be fairly normal, since we move from the tonic E minor to the relative major of G and then back to E minor, the details of that trajectory present a slightly more individual approach. The first section concludes on the dominant of B major. The second section starts in B major, but Dufaut always keeps it sounding like a dominant harmony, so that until the final measures of the second section, E minor continues to be the real tonic. Right before the end of the second section, we move to the relative major of G, which is also carried over to the beginning of the third section. This modulation to G, however, is also short-lived, as Dufaut starts pulling the harmony back towards E minor already in the third measure, and soon afterwards E minor has once again become the dominant tonality. In other words, with a couple of momentary exceptions, the entire Pavane is anchored in E minor, and this constant gravitational pull towards E minor adds an air of melancholy resignation to the entire piece. While the lute and the harpsichord are very different instruments, they do share one essential aspect in how the sound is produced, since in both instruments the strings are plucked. This means there are certain performance elements we can transfer from one instrument to the other, and doing so, at least in my opinion, can enhance the performance of lute music on the harpsichord. Brief parenthetical remark. Because 2 of the expressive devices I will talk about, namely arpeggiation and dislocation, can oftentimes overlap, especially in a piece like this Pavane, I would like to first present all of my suggestions, and then I'm going to demonstrate everything together using the opening measures of the Pavane. And now back to my suggestions. One particular performing device that is common between lute and harpsichord playing is the arpeggiation of chords. As I have mentioned in previous videos, arpeggiating chords is a means of exploiting the resonance of the harpsichord in order to achieve subtle dynamic changes, and therefore arpeggiation is an essential expressive device in harpsichord playing. However, it is important to keep three things in mind. First, it's preferable to employ a wide variety of arpeggiations, not only in terms of speed, but also in terms of direction, in other words, moving upwards or downwards, or adding other enhancements such as inserting passing notes. As a point of departure, you can always consult tables of ornaments that accompanied the publications of harpsichord music, where some possibilities for arpeggiating chords were included. For instance, if we look at the table of ornaments included in the pièce de clavecin of Jean-Henri d'Anglebert, we find the following possibilities. What you see is the last line of the table of ornaments in the pièce de clavecin of Jean-Henri d'Anglebert. And what you see are two treble clef staves. The top one is actually showing you the chord that you would theoretically see in the music, and then the little signs, the little ornamental signs, and then in the staff below, you actually see how those ornaments are to be executed. And of course, in this case, we also have ornaments that have to do with chords. So if we look at the very first one, we are basically dealing with this type of chord, but the first ornament sign tells you that you're supposed to play it like this. And then the second one is a little bit more complex, because now we have two passing notes. And notice how d'Anglebert has notated them in such a way that the passing notes are not held, but the notes of the chord, and especially the G and the C, are actually held, so that the final sonority is always the chord itself. Now, if you skip a couple of ornaments and you go to the fifth one where it says arpeggiate, here we see that there's a slash on the bottom note, and this denotes that we should arpeggiate the chord upwards. So the next one, autre, now has a slash on the top note, so now we arpeggiate the chord downwards. And then the next two are showing you basically the same thing, only now we have a four-note chord. The first one and the second one. So what I'm suggesting here is that basically, even if you look at table of ornaments, you are already getting certain ideas as to how to arpeggiate chords. It doesn't mean that these are your only options. However, it's a good starting point. It shows you, perhaps we could say, some standard ways of arpeggiating chords, and then knowing these and actually looking at the rest of the ornaments, you can get inspired, you can get ideas as to how to proceed with varying your arpeggiations. The second thing to keep in mind, especially if you're coming from modern piano playing, is that arpeggiations don't have to start before the beat. What I mean by this is that the standard way of arpeggiating chords in modern piano playing is by starting before the beat and finishing the arpeggiation with the top note coming on the beat. This is a very melodic way of thinking, since the top note is treated as a melody note that appears on the beat, and the harmonic content of the chord comes before the beat so as to not interrupt the melodic flow. This emphasis on melody at the expense of harmony is not really part of the Baroque aesthetic, and therefore there are other ways of arpeggiating chords. One alternative is to do the opposite of what I just described, meaning starting with the bass note on the beat, with the remaining notes coming after the beat. The method I personally tend to use more often is a little more flexible and varied. It involves arpeggiating a chord in a way that occupies the space around the beat, starting ever so slightly before the beat and ending ever so slightly after the beat. And as I said, I'm going to demonstrate all of these possibilities later. The third issue to keep in mind is that, as with any other expressive device, it is important not to use it excessively to the point where it loses its expressive power and becomes a mannerism. Another important expressive device is usually referred to as dislocation, or sometimes as hand displacement, and denotes the idea of not playing both hands together, but rather one after another. You can also think of it as not synchronizing the hands. It's important to mention that dislocation was an essential expressive device even in piano playing up to the early 20th century. So the idea of always synchronizing or playing hands together is very much a 20th century performing convention. There are several reasons to employ dislocation. For instance, it can be used to better illuminate a phrase or a musical line within a polyphonic texture, but it can also play an expressive role. For instance, by delaying the arrival of a particular note, we can create a sense of dynamic crescendo. Dislocation and arpeggiation certainly have common ground and can be used at the same time. There are passages where it may be hard to distinguish whether one or the other device is used, or if there is a combination of both. As I mentioned before, it's important that any expressive device is not used excessively. However, the extent to which expressive devices are used depends not only on the performer's taste, but also the context. Certainly, I use more arpeggiations and dislocations in a slow piece like this Pavane than I would in, say, a gigue. Another issue to consider concerns whether or not to enrich the harmony. What I mean by this is that when it comes to playing chords, it might appear that the harpsichord has an advantage over the lute in that we can use both hands and thus play fuller chords. However, notice that I said it might appear that this is an advantage, because in reality, a skillful composer is aware that some harmonies on an instrument like the lute can be implied rather than stated. And this can open up a whole world of harmonic and expressive possibilities whereby a particular incomplete sonority can allude to multiple harmonic meanings. So while it may be very tempting to fill in some of the chords with more notes, to me this is something that should be done very sparingly so that it leaves harmonic ambiguities intact. If there are places that sound a little empty, that's where you can use dislocation or arpeggiation to spread out the notes and thus use the instrument's resonance to enrich a simple sonority. A final consideration involves the speed of the ornaments, which, in my opinion, should reflect the character of the piece. This is because ornaments don't have to just be ornamental. They can also have an expressive dimension. Since pavanes tend to be solemn and meditative pieces in a moderate tempo, I try to play ornaments in a somewhat relaxed and slow manner. In other words, I try to fill up the time I have to play the ornament as much as I can, rather than perform the ornament very quickly. In this way, ornaments become part of the general mood of the piece. And now let me demonstrate all of these performing and expressive elements I have been talking about. As I mentioned before, I would like to demonstrate by looking at the opening measures of the Pavane. The one thing I would like to mention here is that when it comes to arpeggiation and dislocation, in this piece especially, it is kind of difficult to tell them apart because the piece is conceived in such a chordal manner where of course the chords are distributed among both hands. So I will try to demonstrate and kind of exaggerate some of the effects so that you can get the idea, but obviously in a performance I may be a little more subtle with some of these effects. So let's start, and first what I want to do is simply play the opening measures as they are. In other words, with block chords, not arpeggiating, not changing anything from the notation. Now, let me show you first of all approximately what kind of performance decisions I have in mind. In other words, how I want to employ arpeggiation and dislocation within these measures. And then I'm going to break down a little bit more what I do, and I will talk about the different kinds of arpeggiations and also dislocations that can be used as an expressive device. So to me, this immediately makes the piece much more expressive and much more interesting actually musically. But now let me go ahead and tell you what I'm doing and kind of differentiate between the different types of arpeggiations and dislocations I'm using. The first thing I mentioned when it came to arpeggiations had to do with the fact that we don't always need to play them where the top note is on the beat and everything else happens before the beat. So in other words, what I'm trying to differentiate between is something like this. Again, I'm going to start the piece and then I want to concentrate on this sonority. Now, if I were to arpeggiate this, there are three ways of doing it. One is, as I said, to make sure that the beat is actually on the beat, so that it would sound like this. Which is a melodic way of doing it. Then I could do the opposite, where I make sure that now the E is on the beat. In other words, instead of that. So you could do something like this. Or you could do something in between. And I kind of like that in between because this way I can bring out the inner voice. You can also do the same thing with the next chord, this one. So again, instead of going, it could be, or both of them somewhere in between. Which again to me gives me more possibilities, but also helps to kind of illuminate how the inner voices are moving and also keep the harmonic content of the piece intact. And you've probably noticed already that this is a very harmonically conceived piece. It doesn't mean there is no melody, it's just that the melody arises out of the harmony. The other thing, when it comes to dislocations, it's a little more difficult to really have them stand out when you have so many chords. And of course I was playing some of the left hand notes a little before the right hand, for instance, or... But this could also be perceived as being part of the chord itself. There are other parts though here where we only have two notes that are played, one in the left hand and one in the right hand. So when I get to this part, for instance, and then... Now what I can do here, and what I think is going to increase the expressive content of this passage, is if I delay the right hand note, in other words, do something like this instead of this, because we all know we want to get somewhere, but I am delaying that. So I'm creating this kind of anticipation, this kind of tension, and this also creates a certain dynamic crescendo. This is what I called a dynamic crescendo before, because you expect me to go somewhere, but I don't immediately, and then I can even delay the next one even more. And this one, by the way, I can make it even more expressive by, instead of playing these two notes, kind of filling in the chord. So... In other words, you have all of these different expressive possibilities, and this is how you really create subtle dynamic changes in harpsichord playing. The last thing that I mentioned had to do with the speed of the trills, and now for this I would have to go a little past the measures that I played. So if I continue from where I had left off, there are going to be a couple of trills in the next few measures, and what I want to do is first of all play them fast, play them like regular trills, and then I will show you how I play them a little more slowly. Let me start a little further from where I had left off. Now let me show you how I would rather play them within the context of this piece. In other words, I play them more slowly in a more relaxed manner, almost a little lazy, let's say, trying to fill out the entire time that I have, and sometimes even going beyond. And of course, here's where I can also use dislocation again to kind of delay the arrival of a note in another part so that I have time to complete the trill. One final remark. The edition I'm using is a transcription of the original tablature by André Souris, published in the series Corpus des lutistes français by Édition du Centre National de la Recherche Scientifique in Paris in 1965. As always, thank you for watching, and I hope you enjoy the performance. Thank you.